Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. It is your local community radio station. My name is Andy and I will be with you for the next hour. I'm coming to you this week from Awabakal and Warramai country down in Newcastle, New South Wales. I have come down here for the People's Blockade of the world's biggest coal port, of which you'll probably be hearing more in the coming weeks on the Paradigm Shift. But today on the show, we are going to be going back in time to a famous campaign of non-violent civil disobedience, which had an extraordinary effect and has been used as a sort of case study for this kind of protest action ever since. And that is what is called Otpor, which is the Serbian word for resistance. And Otpor was a group of mostly students in the late 90s, early 2000s, who got together to try to overthrow the authoritarian rule of Slobodan Milosevic, the then president, who of course had been involved in very brutal wars in the Balkan region and also was quite brutal against his own people in repressing freedoms and democracy. And so Otpor, without too much experience, of course it had been a communist country for much of the second half of the 20th century, and so there wasn't a long tradition of people doing social movements, taking on the government. But Otpor, a group of young people with a strong desire to make a change, they decided that they would do what they could, and with a bit of guidance along the way, but a lot of creativity and courage, they managed to oust Slobodan Milosevic, the dictator, and lead Serbia into some kind of democracy. You will hear more about it over the course of the show, and so I won't go on too much. Instead, I'll introduce my guest, Vesna Cerroni, who was involved with Otpor from the very beginning, currently based in Australia, and it was a pleasure to speak to Vesna and hear this quite significant piece of history of us activists doing social movements, even though it did happen in another part of the world in a previous time. But this is our story of ordinary people trying to make a difference in power structures that are stacked against us. And so it was great to chat to her. And also, it's a story of young people having fun and believing that they can change the world, getting together and working together, which is an awesome story as well. Even if you don't manage to topple a dictator, what better way to live and to spend your youth than by believing that you can change the world? So anyway, let's get into it and let's hear from Vesna Cerroni.
My name is Vesna Cerroni, and I work for Bob Brown Foundation, and I used to be in my student days activist of movement called Resistance, or Otpor in Serbian. That was one of the initiating movements that broke down Milosevic regime and brought democracy to Serbia.
Yes, and we're all going to know a lot more about Otpor by the end of this interview than we do right now. But to begin with, let's start with before Otpor exists. Could you give us some background of what the political situation was like in what's now called Serbia, what was then called Yugoslavia, at the time before 1998 when Otpor formed?
Sure, yes. To start with, when I was a child, it was under Tito regime, and Yugoslavia after the Second World War was a communist country. Although Yugoslavia, I can say, was probably the most liberal of communist countries in that region, but still, it was a communist country. And then when Tito passed in 1980, there was about a decade. We had 6 republics, so these 6 republics were taking shifts if who will be in charge. And that kind of worked for like 10 years. And then a lot of those republics, especially, first it was Slovenia, followed by Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina wanted to gain their independence. And so that was during the socialist regime. So we went from communist to socialist regime. And Slovenia got away quite okay, to say. There was no bloodshed or anything like that. So that was in 1991. The problem started in the region in 1992 when Croatia wanted to separate, and then a year later in 1993 when Bosnia and Herzegovina wanted to separate. And the reason for that was because that was multinational, multicultural, and also based on different religions in those regions. So you had Serbs, you had Croats, and you had Bosnians, and they all wanted to claim their own territories because it was very, very mixed population. So then Yugoslavia started falling apart, and slowly Milosevic was at that time president of Serbia, and he sent his troops from Serbia. It was also his part of presence and influence in that war that happened for 3 years at that time. So that was then, and then later, people were very, very unhappy in Serbia about how he was leading the country. It was very, he was promoting bloodshed. And when we had elections in 1996, those were local elections, and we voted against Milosevic in the largest cities around Serbia. But he stole elections. He said, no, this is, I won. So he claimed victory, although he lost. And then there was a student movement, and I was a freshman, so I also participated in those protests back then. And we went actually into a Guinness Book of Records for the longest protest ever. So we were protesting on the streets for 118 days, 24/7. Meaning, of course, not one person. We took shifts, 2 hours each. It was during the winter. It was very, very cold winter because we wanted for him to, step out. And at the end, after 118 days, he surrendered those larger cities. So we claimed victories, but that was only on a local level. And that a year later, in 1997, those protests finished, Otpor was founded. So back to your question about Otpor.
Okay, so we are up to 1998, and you and some other students have formed a group called Otpor. What were the initial aims of making this group?
Yes, the initial aims of this group were, at that time, there was, just before Otpor was found, it was new university law, which actually pretty much allowed Milosevic to point out his staff and, professors who are just members of his political party, sack everybody who was disagreeing with him, with his regime, especially in universities like of political science, of law. And that was unacceptable for us. So we founded movement at that time, Otpor, meaning resistance, and we had 3 demands. One was to have free university, meaning not to have that university law that was imposed by Milosevic's government. Second was to free media to be independent because it was completely controlled by Milosevic. So people were able to see only his side, that everything is beautiful and functioning and not the wars and turmoils and hyperinflation. So that was the second, free media. And third demand that we had was to have free and fair elections, as we had in the past, that he was stealing them. So that's how we started. And it was just at the beginning like dozen of people, of students. Some of them already took place in 96 and 97 protests when they were, like myself, freshmen. And then at that time when Otpor was founded, we were already at our last years of university. And of course, a lot of younger students joined later on, and even high school. High school is in Europe from age of 15, so a little bit older than here. And at that time, during 1999, bombing happened by NATO countries as a response to Serbia's interference in Kosovo. And we were at that time on standby, meaning there was nothing happening. People were just trying to survive that period, and that lasted for, I think, like 78 days. And after that, we were quite certain that Milosevic will fall, because all that bombing happened as a result of his bad politics. But on contrary, he was as stronger as never. And because he made, with his controlled media, he made people believe that there is like a conspiracy theory against Serbs and that we are all so good. But because we are the east of the west and west of the east, politically and geographically looking, that we are attractive to other countries as a territory. And so his population grew, and we were shocked to see that to have a dictator even being stronger after so many people suffered. And that's when we started. So Otpor was founded in 1998, but our actual proper work started from August 1999. And within less than a year, we grew from, at that time, there were maybe between 30 and 50 of us. We grew into a movement that we call later national movement, not only student, because we just outgrew ourselves. And we had over 100,000 members. So that was a huge growth. And our primary focus was, we focused everything on non-violence. That's important to say.
Obviously, it's very different, a group of 30 to a group of 100,000. Can you tell us about how Otpor was structured and why it was decided to structure the group this way?
Yes, we had unusual structure that I don't think, maybe it was somewhere before, but I don't know, maybe we were the first, but we decided to have no leader. So that was different. Usually all movements or organizations, they have their leaders and they have structure. We had, from that point of view, we had non-official structure, but we didn't have official structure, meaning that in the past, in that previous students' movement, Milosevic was arresting always the leaders, putting them, imprisoning them, and then other people would be afraid. So we say he can't arrest us all. So we will have no leader, and we would just be a bunch of students. So we didn't want to play by his rules. We made up our rules, and that was something. We did have some sort of structure, of course, just not official. We had 4 groups. One was to work with universities across Serbia. Second one was press, so all media releases, everything that has to do with media statements, etc., interviews. Third was to network with other organizations, with political parties, and between the cities. And the fourth one was the creative team that planned ongoing activities. I was myself working in press, and I was a spokesperson for international relations. That was my unofficial role.
So, what did Otpor do? Obviously, it grew very quickly and had a lot of influence. What kind of tactics did the group use?
We had actions, very, very, very creative actions, and they were happening all the time. We had some small ones on daily basis and some larger ones on weekly basis. So that was the role of creative team. We had first, our symbol was fist, meaning braveness. So my friend, he's a designer, so he drew a fist, and then we put graffitis all over the time, first in Belgrade and then, to smaller towns as well. And it was really, people were wondering, what is this? What is this movement? Just says Otpor and the fist, or only the fist. And then later we start putting other signs like it is time and he is done in Serbian language, but that's when you translate it. And it was just at the beginning, people were wondering, what are these, who are these people? And then when we started having these creative actions, we used a lot of satire, a lot of humor, because dictators, they don't like humor. And because we were majority of us, well, all of us who began when they were all students, and we had, of course, a lot of supporters at universities. A lot of students joined then because they saw no future in this regime. And when they had somebody who is brave enough to stand up and creative, because people already felt like they want to change the system, they want to live, much, much better lives. And so we gave them that belief, because before even people who agree with us, they had no one to kind of initiate that, and they didn't believe that the change is possible. So with our actions, we made them believe that change is possible, and that it takes only one person, and, one person after one person, and then all of a sudden you have a group. And sometimes I like to use word sexy, meaning that the movement grew. It was attractive to young people to join in. Even it was the best party in town. It was happening. They could meet new people, interact. So it became like a cool place to be and a creative place to be. That's how it started among young people. And as I mentioned, in other university places around Serbia, it just spread it so fast. And on the other hand, we did have a support that's also worth mentioning. There was at the beginning 4 of us in that group. We called it Group for External Support. And it was really strange because in those circumstances, like you have one person who is, who had network because his father was a famous movie director, me because I spoke English, the other guy who was IT, and the fourth person who had a place that we can hide from police. So we wrote like a 1-page statement. At that time, we were very careful of what to say, like we are students, but, why are we different from the rest? And we sent it to all the contacts we could possibly found. At that time, it was still dial-up internet, and, it wasn't Google search, and we didn't have those platforms available. So we reached out to many embassies, international organizations, institutions, everybody we could think of, and asked for help to help us in removing dictator. And we were amazed of how much response we got, how much feedback. So people start our inbox was just full, and some organizations offered financial support, some of them offered know-how, some of them just... I worked, for example, at that time, I was correspondent. I became for CNN, BBC, ABC, MSNBC, all other also less known international outlet medias. And just we wanted to spread the story, basically. So we received much, much, much help. And that financial support also helped us to have more materials for printing, publishing, T-shirts, etc. So that also helped us grow.
That element of it, the funding, I guess, especially from the US government, has maybe become a bit more of a contentious thing in the years since Otpor. So I guess it's an interesting question. How did the group navigate that support being offered by international organisations or governments? Was there a process for deciding what funding to take and what not to take, and whether there were strings attached, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't contact anybody that we disagreed with their policies, so that's in the first place. And we were not, to my knowledge, approached by any organization who would be, not agreeing or not standing for democracy and human rights. So, like, we did have help from American organizations like USAID, NED, but also a lot of European institutions and foundations who approached us. And also, as I said, apart from that financial support, we had a lot of know-how. So they were teaching us how to write a statement, how to have media appearance, how to write projects, etc. So we did have a lot of know-how that was even, I think, more valuable than just pure funds. And of course, we at the beginning, when we accepted that help, before we accepted it, we said there was no strings attached, meaning we just want to bring democracy, and only if we have nothing in return. We couldn't provide or follow anybody's politics or whatever they can have impact on us. So we were 100% independent in that sense, meaning just help us to remove this dictator and bring democracy to the region of the Western Balkans.
To go back to on the streets of Serbia, you're doing these graffiti and protest rallies, things like that. What was the response from the government?
Yes, it was very bad response, of course. Milosevic recognized, we always say he's a crazy man, but he's a smart man at the same time. So he knew that we became a big threat for him, because before in the past, the way he was functioning is he would just break opposition, and then they couldn't unite, and then he was just major party in a way. But we were students, we were no political party, and we had no affiliation in that content. So he started a huge media campaign against us, and he officially at that time called us that Otpor is the enemy of state, just like in the movies, but that was really happening. And the peak was in May 2000, when he broke into Studio B, which was radio and television that was still independent in the center of Belgrade, and also started arresting everybody who had like any Otpor sign, meaning if you have a t-shirt or a badge that you're carrying. He just started having huge arrests of us, and we responded to that. And our tactics was, for every arrested student or person, we would have 10 people in front of that prison until those people are released. So, for example, if you would have 5 of us arrested, you would have 50 people. If you had more, more people. And then you had a lot of passerbys, and they just looking and asking, why are you in front of this police station? And we had banners and protesting and whistles, and we were quite loud. And then people who were devastated, they would just join us. And he saw that to be counterproductive. And in the end, he gave up on that tactics because it was not working for him. And in the meantime, we also had support even from elderly people. It was wonderful when we were walking, protesting, even either actions or for people being arrested. They would give us support when it was winter, for example. It was very cold winter, and they would be like some grannies making warm tea for us, like a lot of, because there were a lot of us, quantities and just giving to us, or warm bakery stuff that they made at home, they baked for us. So it was very sweet, or just flagging and applauding us, or whistling, or raising their fists. And it was beautiful to see people being united in the same cause, in a very, very non-violent way, towards a guy who was always violent.
As the state repression grew and as the movement grew, did your tactics have to evolve?
Yes and no. I mean, our tactics per se did not involve, in the meaning that we had two main features. One was to unite opposition. So we had a lot of meetings with them, trying to tell them that, even who would be pro-center, pro-left, or even slightly right, that they need to agree that they have a common enemy, and not, how many ministries they will have, and how many seats in the parliament, etc. So unless they do that, they will never get a chance to win. So that was one. And the other one was to name and shame regime, meaning we continued with our funny, ironic actions towards Milosevic and his government. So we just grew, and our number grew, our know-how grew, because, as I mentioned, we had support. So for that extent, we did slightly adjust, but our main focus remained the same. Just our actions became much larger. For example, we would take over the whole park, student park, in front of where all the universities are, and say, oh, this is the free country and you have a passport to enter, and then a country that we would all like the Serbia to be, for example. So we just went larger, on a larger scale, but our actions did not, and our tactics did not change. We were determined from the day one, and we knew exactly what we want to achieve.
That kind of creating a free republic within the park is one example of a creative action, and I guess Otpor is known for humorous and creative actions. Could you give us a couple of other examples of the humor and creativity?
Yes. For example, we had Milosevic in his prison taking around. Then we had, we were all the time asked, like, how are we financing ourselves? Because they wanted, as I mentioned, that the government wanted to paint us as an enemy of the state. And then since we were getting international support, they would, find that against us, to say, oh, well, they are doing what the West is telling them to do, which was not the case, but we did receive support. So not to go into that trap, we told whoever would join the movement, if we were asked by his secret service or whoever, how are we being financed? We always say, because our currency is dinar, and we say one dinar for Milosevic. One dinar has like a penny, not a big value. And they would be aggravated of not knowing who is the leader and how are we being financed, because one dinar, how many people will give one dinar? We had like 7 million people. So that was witty. The witty was, for example, we had many actions, but for one that went viral later, and I think it was discussed globally later on as a non-violent tactic, was also when we had that barrow, and we put Milosevic like a figure face on that barrow, and we put a bat right next to it in a main pedestrian street of Belgrade, and we sat just in a cafe nearby, and people were passing by, and they saw Milosevic, and put on a barrow and a bat, and they just started hitting, just like to express their frustration. And of course, police came immediately, but there was nobody to arrest because we were sitting in a nearby cafe. We didn't have any markings of Otpor, so they didn't know who to arrest. And they were standing there, and they couldn't let that continue because there were more and more people attracting, and it became like everybody wanted to go. People were calling each other on phone, oh, you gotta come to the pedestrian street, there is a barrow, we can hit Milosevic. And it just grew into like a party, so they arrested a barrow. Imagine police taking and arresting a barrow. So this kind of, creativity was something that those were our weekly actions. So we had every week, and people would be just expecting, oh, what will be next week or this week. So everybody wanted to participate in that sense.
So in 2000, Slobodan Milosevic was forced to step down. There was an election, but Otpor is given a lot of credit for it. Can you tell us how that happened?
Yes, of course, that day didn't happen overnight. It was a lot of constant work with us and with the opposition of Serbia. And we prepared, we were all the time at that time on the streets, and then we decided with opposition parties that we would have, it was non-political, although there were political parties, but it was just initiated by us. And it was on 5th of October, that was in 2000. It was resolved because we had elections on the 24th of September in 2000. And of course, Milosevic did, but these were state elections. So he did what he did back in 96 when there were local elections. He just claimed the victory, although he lost. And from 24th of September onwards, every day we were on the streets protesting. And we called on 5th of October the whole country to come to Belgrade in front of the parliament. So we planned massive protests. We didn't know that day will be the day, but that at least we were going towards that day because we were determined not to give up. And it was 5th of October. Really, it was, maybe you saw photos or footages how massive that day was, and people were coming really from everywhere from Serbia. And he started putting tear gas to us, so we were all crying. And he cut off all internet, meaning not all networks, also mobile, so we couldn't communicate with one another. For example, my mother was crying because she heard that one girl died accidentally while she was climbing some truck, and she thought it was me because I always want to sit in front and see the best. So because there was no network to communicate, to call each other. So that was the day when police and when military decided to disobey Milosevic. And I need to say, just before that, why they disobeyed it. Even before, it's worth mentioning that every time we would be beat up by police, as the police was instructed by Milosevic, of course, and his party to do so. We would say, we are not your enemies. We would use this student card, just raise it like a white flag in a way and say, you should be with us. You are our people. Don't hit us. Milosevic is destroying our country. So every time they started violence, we fired back with non-violence. And, sometimes it took time. Of course, that was probably 18 months. But among military and among police, they saw really in the end the enemy, and they saw that there is no future with this dictator. And they just gave up, and they redraw themselves. They redraw helicopters. They redraw weapons. They opened, because they were keeping the parliament, so they just took off, and we entered the parliament, and we entered regime's media controlled, and it was that was already evening, like 10 p.m., and the network started working again, and we addressed the national television and some local television, although it was 10 p.m. at night, we say, "Good morning, Serbia," because it was the beginning of democracy. So we managed with non-violent actions to remove him out of power, and soon after, a couple of months later, he was sent to the Hague Tribunal for his war crimes on a trial.
Wow, what a day.
Indeed. Yes. It looks like a scene from the movie, but it was the real life.
Well, I'm sure there was a lot of celebrating, but it's a big change to go, I guess, change political systems. How did that transition go for the nation of Yugoslavia and also for Otpor?
our job was done. Otpor said that we had these three rules to begin with: free university, free media, and free and fair elections, and our job was done. So there was a little, maybe like a small group of Otpor who wanted for Otpor to become political party, but like 98% of us were not interested. So there was a try to work as together with Democratic Party, which was the ruling party after Milosevic was taken away. But, we decided not to. It's not worth proceeding. So let's leave Otpor in a history where it belongs. And we had one campaign, last campaign that we did, that was towards the new government. And we said, we are just watching you, meaning do not let Milosevic happen again. So if, we can always reinvent ourselves if it's needed. So be careful. We don't want another turmoil to happen, another instability in the Balkans, in our region. And for for other former republics of Yugoslavia, now independent countries, it's started meaning reconciliation, to be honest. Just people going over what war brought them and recovering from them and starting working with Serbia and among themselves to just put all the bad things behind us and say, okay, let's focus on working together, on being good neighbors. It's like when you are in marriage and then you divorce and then you go through a hell and then in the end say, okay, we need to be, peaceful because we have children together, something like that. So yes, it was a reconciliation time and just starting to blossom again. And then it was another transition. So we had communism, we had socialism, we had dictatorship, and then finally democracy.
So these days, often in literature about nonviolent protest, Otpor is used as a case study. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's useful. It's very useful. We did travel a lot in those years after Otpor and after democracy, and just share our knowledge of nonviolence with other regimes. We even, some of my friends, Srđan Popović, for example, he had his own movement created later called Canvas, and they focused on enabling some countries under dictatorship with our know-how, with the knowledge that he had. So in a way, he trained them how to use nonviolence. Of course, it's not copy-paste. You cannot have one strategy that will work for all. So you need to get creative, depending on what the situation in those countries are. But the always impact is on nonviolence, of being creative and not to play the way your government plays, so to have your own game. So I think it's very useful to know, because it's not time related, and nonviolence is especially in today's world when we have what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Ukraine, etc., in other regions, in Africa, like even some civil wars. So it's very, very important to keep that in mind, and I think it's very good to know that the change is possible without any bloodshed.
And for you personally, looking back at this time of your life, how does it make you feel?
I feel very, very proud. It's something which is, it just happens once in a lifetime, and it's, if I lived elsewhere before that, I was doing my studies in America, so I would be so sad if I did not return to Serbia back then and miss all that engagement that I had. And it just it created me in what I am today. For example, before Otpor days, I thought that my profession would go in a different direction. I was writing poetry, I was singing, I was playing piano, so it was more this artistic soul, and I thought that I will pursue later in career. But with these days of activism, and there's so much work needed all over the world, and I just never actually escaped that activism. It just grew on me, and now I work, as I mentioned, for Bob Brown Foundation. I'm a passionate environmentalist because we do want to make this world better place for all of us. So for that, it created me. It grew. You have self-esteem, you have courage, and you have a feeling that there's nothing you cannot do, So I always opt for new challenges, and I'm very, very proud.
All right, thanks very much, Vesna, for chatting with us about this amazing piece of history.
Thank you for initiating. It was my pleasure to share my story.
That was Vesna Cerroni we have been listening to for most of the last hour, and it has been my pleasure to bring you this little slice of history. There's so many valuable things to learn about the past, not just the victories, I should say. Also, I guess the failures of the past can teach us a lot as well, and even inspire us, as well as giving us valuable lessons. But this was one of the times where people power was successful, people getting together and using their courage, their creativity, and their networks to build a movement that was capable of challenging power, even power entrenched by a very violent regime. And so it is amazing hearing stories like this, and so valuable. So it is a thing that I try to do on the Paradigm Shift somewhat often. We have stories of history because I do think, it is useful for us in imagining a different future, to know where we've come from, but also to know how other people have managed to create change over the years. And of course, many things are different in our context, but some things might be the same, and certainly the need for people who are dedicated and principled and skilled to get together and think creatively about what they can do to get out a different message to that which is put forward by the status quo. Well, I think that is going to be required anywhere where we can make positive social change. That is about all we have time for on the Paradigm Shift. I hope you have enjoyed the show today. If you are interested in finding out more about Otpor, there are quite a lot of resources out there, things that have been written about it or documentary films made about it. And I will, of course, be back next week with more tales of people trying to create a better world. I will see you then.